You see, remember, we know something most folks don't know. All the sickness that black folks have, sugar diabetes, high blood pressure, all of that, nobody will die here today because there's an energy that supersedes all pain when you know your pain is being administered to.
Welcome to another installment of Dick Gregory's listening sessions here in Anacostia, Washington, D.C. We're talking about Raise the Ruckus, Not the Drug Prices. These are listening sessions about minority health disparities. And with us today, we have Brian Argret from City First Bank. And with Brian, we're going to talk a little bit about how the problem and struggle of prescription drugs and affording those drugs actually fits into a much bigger struggle of financial struggle that a lot of our patients go through. So, Brian, can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen when patients struggle with affording prescription drugs versus affording rent versus affording their groceries?
So thank you. We're also here in the Anacostia Arts Center in Anacostia. And City First Foundation, which is affiliated with the bank, is hosting a conference on housing, on affordable housing specifically. And in our data presentation, as part of this conference, which brings experts all throughout the continuum to discuss solutions, Ed Lazier from the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and I hope I remember this correctly, put up a slide that showed at 30% of AMI, 60% of our residents are dedicating 60% of their income to housing. So what that means is you are naturally making choices about the other things you can't afford. And this is exactly where prescription drugs or child care or transportation come into play. So you're absolutely right. I mean, when we think about really the economic disparities, particularly in the minority communities, we're having to make choices we shouldn't have to make, just around basic fundamental health issues. Again, whether that's your financial health, your physical health, your mental health, or the progress of your children.
Right. And I think, too often these struggles are framed around personal responsibility, when in fact the person is actually just doing the best that they can to keep their head above water in the midst of all of these costs that face them on a daily basis. So what's another way that we can approach this in terms of solutions and giving people relief?
So to your point, I heard something else today that I think is interesting. At 30% of AMI, which is area median income for our audience, you're talking about folks who are minimum wage. So first of all, these are folks working extraordinarily hard.
Right.
So first we've got to get rid of that myth of this is not someone going to work every day working very hard. And yet that struggle that I mentioned, that choice, that unfair choice is there. So part of what we were exploring today is if that's the largest component of your spend, housing, and we can figure out how to make that more affordable, then that frees up disposable income, although it's not really disposable, but needed income for other things. I'm not an expert in the health sector, so I certainly can't suggest how to bring down prescription drug prices. I have some crazy theories, but they're just my ideas. But I think really we have to look at the overall burden that our residents who are working or perhaps who are not because they're in between work or challenged in any sort of way, and how they make basic ends meet. And that requires both our citizenry, it requires nonprofits to help, it requires our for-profit institutions to have a bigger view about how you move a society forward. And then, of course, it involves our state government, our district government in this case, and our federal government to really provide that critical gap that the others can't do.
And I think you're bringing up a great point about how when we approach something like housing and we just take the pressure off and we take some of the burden, that it does relieve some income that can now be used to address some of these other false choices where we don't have families that are having to pick between groceries and prescriptions. So even if you're not necessarily a health expert, you're actually able to have a positive impact on health by just doing a better job with, something like housing costs.
That's absolutely right, Sam.
And so, are there examples that you've seen recently that that people can look to and say, yeah, we need more of that?
So, I'm not sure I have a concrete example that would be helpful, but I do want to go to something you were saying earlier. In economic empowerment or community development or economic justice, social justice, all of which I think are intertwined, we happen to be talking about housing, but as you said, you cannot address any one problem without looking at the others. So back to solutions. You've got the revenue side, which is the income, and you have efforts around that, such as living wage and other things to try and increase one's wages. You also have programmatic opportunities of how do we get people to be in a better position to earn. That's all very hard, but it needs to be done. So this is a concurrent philosophy. And then on the expense side, not just housing, all of the components of which we are spending money to survive, we need to figure out how we make them more affordable, whether it's transportation, whether it's housing, or in your area of specialties, whether it's our medical expenses.
And when it comes to housing and transportation, I feel like I have patients who tell me all the time that it's a major limiting factor for coming to their appointments, for being on time for appointments, for picking up prescriptions. And so, from what you see, like, what do you feel are like the biggest obstacles right now to those housing and transportation?
So in the district and in the DMV, we have this problem compounded. So we've got a city that's growing. We have wealth, which is being concentrated everywhere, really, but certainly in the center of the city. And then you have residents which are finding their affordable housing further and further away. And so what does that do? It compounds the problem. So maybe now I can afford my apartment, but I've got to commute an hour and a half to work. All right, well, that's my transportation cost, which is going up. That's childcare. And let's say now I've got a doctor's appointment. Right? Now, how can I fit that in, and how do I cover all of those? Do I take off of work, and there's my income goes down? Do I have to pay somebody to pick up my child after work? So it's so intertwined. And in DC, I think in any high-cost housing market, you've just got that fundamental basis being challenged.
And one of the other things that I appreciate about your bank is the attention they pay to communities that have been here for generations and getting to, maintain that integrity of the community. And so if you could speak a little bit about how important it is for communities to feel like that they have roots and history here and that they want to be able to pass that on to another generation.
To be frank, our view of an equitable society is one that is equitable. It spans across tenure, race, economics, right? So in the biggest picture of what we're thinking about, it really is around equity, racial equity, economic equity, social justice, however you can flip them and say them either way. And so when you talk about a community where investment either receded, and let me speak to this, hopefully this won't be too long-winded, but our bank was founded, City First was founded in Northwest, where we had disinvestment, where no longer in the communities, in a lot of the communities in DC, people were pulling out investment. Housing stock was deteriorating. People were leaving. So this is 25 years ago, if you put that in context. And to be frank, it wasn't about starting a bank. It was about how can we use finance as a tool to help empower the communities. And so we still feel that way, and it's very much true. Those neighborhoods, some of those neighborhoods have changed, and our work, for example, in housing, since that's our topic of today, has moved from not just the creation of affordable housing, but the preservation. And that's really to your point. How do we create a diverse, economically diverse racially diverse community that has the amenities that everyone is looking for, but also has the support services within that community and has the affordability where it can be earned. And so as we think about our work in any community, but again, we were founded on focus on low and moderate income community, disenfranchised communities, if you will. We're very concerned about how we keep people there, how we help them to prosper, again, to this concept of true equity, right? Give them the opportunity, but also recognize where the opportunity has been taken away, right? And how do we fill that? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. This is Brian Argaret from City First Bank, and you've been listening to the Dick Gregory listening sessions, Raise the Ruckus, Not the Drug Prices, here at WEAC Radio. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Thank you.
You see, remember, we know something that most folks don't know. All the sickness that black folks have, sugar diabetes, high blood pressure, all of that, nobody will die here today because there's an energy that supersedes all pain when you know your pain is being administered to.